In the echoing halls of Berlin, where history weighed like a ghost on the marble pillars, cameras clicked as a German minister stepped up to the podium, his face pale but resolute, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. "Germany will suspend the export of weapons that could be used in Gaza," he declared, and at once the world jolted as though the tectonic plates beneath it had shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. The crowd murmured like a hive of unsettled bees, and far away in Tel Aviv the words detonated like a bomb inside the war cabinet. Benjamin Netanyahu slammed both fists on the oak table, his eyes flashing with the fire of a cornered predator. "They betray us. Our so-called ally dares humiliate Israel in front of the world," he thundered, aides shifting nervously while screens around the room flashed breaking news banners. Ministers whispering, "Sir, the pressure from Europe is mounting. They fear civilian casualties. They fear their own streets filled with protesters." But Netanyahu snapped, his voice a whip across the silence. "Let them fear. Fear makes them weak. We are strong. We will not bend." He strode to the map of Gaza projected on the wall, pointing sharply. "Our enemies smell blood. They think Germany's betrayal is our weakness. But we will show them Israel does not kneel." And as the room buzzed with his rage, halfway across the world in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest military office, the air hot, heavy with dust and the scent of sweat and earth. A map of Africa spread before him, his eyes steady, his jaw clenched, an aide whispering, "Captain, Germany's decision is shaking the world. The cameras are turning. People are asking what Africa thinks." And Traoré rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow, his voice measured but edged with steel. "Then Africa must answer, not with whispers but with thunder." He walked to a simple wooden podium, the national flag draped behind him, microphones trembling as they picked up his words. "You speak of war, you speak of conquest. You speak of power." His voice deepened, eyes burning into the camera. "But know this. If you start a war, we will strike back." The words cut across airwaves like a blade, igniting social media in a storm of hashtags, flashing across TV tickers from Al Jazeera to CNN, anchors leaning forward. A bold warning from Burkina Faso's captain. Words that shake the balance of power, analysts argued, symbolic or real. While in African streets people roared, painted murals of his face, lifted banners with his words, students chanting, "Strike back, strike back." And in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu watched the broadcast, his lip curling into a snarl. "This boy thinks himself a lion," he hissed. A general replying carefully, "Sir." His words resonate beyond borders, Mali, Niger. Even youth in Europe echo him. Netanyahu spun, his finger stabbing the air. "Then we must roar louder, louder than ever before." While in New York, the United Nations corridors thrummed with tension, diplomats whispering in clusters, an American voice, "He is reckless," a destabilizer, a Russian delegate smirking, or perhaps a mirror, showing the empire what it fears. The Chinese seated calmly, scribbling notes, their eyes darting between screens, calculating, waiting, and the Secretary General whispered to his aide, "History is being written before our eyes." As across the globe, ordinary people felt the tremor. A Palestinian mother clutching her child, whispering, "Maybe someone will stand for us." A German factory worker turning to his wife, "If our leaders stop the weapons, maybe this war will end." A Burkina student hammering on his cracked phone, "Our captain's voice is our sword." And still the story grew like a storm refusing to break. The night electric with possibility and dread. Netanyahu in his bunker pacing, Traoré on his balcony gazing at the stars. Berlin lawmakers torn between conscience and alliance. Paris streets filled with chants and burning torches. London parliaments echoing with debate. Washington strategists murmuring in dim-lit rooms. If Africa unites under him, the balance shifts. While Traoré declared again in another fiery broadcast, sweat glistening on his brow, "Africa will not be silent, not again, not ever." His soldiers pounded their fists on the table in thunderous unison, chants rising like drums of war. The young captain's eyes fierce as he leaned closer to the microphone. "We have been slaves, colonies, pawns in their chess. But no more, hear me, no more." And the world gasped. The narrative no longer Israel versus Gaza alone, but the echo of centuries rising in one defiant man. And in living rooms from Johannesburg to Rio de Janeiro, From Karachi to Istanbul, from London to New York, families argued. Is he mad or is he brave? While in dim-lit military command centers, satellites shifted. Drones lifted, naval fleets stirred, generals tapping their pens nervously. One spark and the fire consumes all. And Netanyahu, sleepless, stared at the glowing map, his reflection fractured in the glass, whispering to himself, if he wants fire, then fire he will get. While in Burkina Faso, Traoré whispered into the dark, if he wants war, then war he will regret. And the camera pans back. The world suspended in silence, the tension like a string drawn to its limit, waiting for the snap that would decide the fate of millions. As dawn cracked across the Mediterranean, waves crashing like distant drums against the hulls of warships, the Israeli Navy prowled restlessly under orders to show presence, radar screens glowing green in the darkness, commanders whispering, if Berlin cuts supply lines, Washington may follow, then what? While Netanyahu's voice echoed through encrypted channels, sharp as glass, we will not hesitate if they stand in our way, they are enemies, and enemies must be treated as such. But his words met hesitation, murmurs of disquiet, a defense minister muttering under his breath, we are not fighting one enemy anymore, we are fighting the court of global opinion. Yet Netanyahu pressed on, rage drowning caution, while in Burkina Faso Traoré sat with his council in a dim, candlelit chamber, maps of Africa spread wide, his finger tracing the Sahel like an artery of fire, his voice low but thunderous in its weight. They expect us to kneel, to fracture, but we are iron when struck together. His generals nodded, one adding, Mali stands with us, Niger as well. Voices rise in Senegal, in Chad, even whispers in Congo, and Traoré's eyes gleamed. Then let them whisper until the whisper becomes a roar. Outside the chamber, thousands gathered with torches, chanting his name, women ululating, men drumming rhythms that echoed into the African night, and across oceans news anchors leaned forward. This is no longer symbolic. This is the forging of a movement. Analysts fretted on split-screen panels, some scoffing. He commands no fleets, no jets. Others warning. He commands something stronger, the faith of millions. And in Washington, the Oval Office curtains were drawn, the president's advisors circling him with reports, one tapping nervously, if this escalates, we face a global South uprising, another whispering, cutting Israel loose is unthinkable, but supporting them openly risks rebellion in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Silence heavy as a coffin filled the room until the president finally muttered, history tests us in the shadows, not the light. And half a world away in Berlin, the chancellor stared at her reflection in the Reichstag's glass. Crowds below chanting for peace. Security chiefs warning of embassies threatened. Trade under fire, and she whispered to herself, we lit a match. May it not burn the house. While Netanyahu called in his war cabinet again, his voice ragged with sleepless fury. Do you hear them? Do you hear the voices gathering against us? Then drown them in fire. But even his closest general shifted uneasily, his voice careful. Sir, every missile we fire creates 100,000 more voices. Every strike gives Traoré a stage. The prime minister's face hardened, eyes bloodshot. Then silence him, find him, break him. Orders flying through satellites, operatives dispatched, cyber units unleashed to choke the captain's words. But in Ouagadougou the youth were faster, smuggling USB sticks, painting slogans on walls, their voices carried in chants that no algorithm could erase. If you start a war, we strike back. The phrase thundered through football stadiums, schools, markets, into songs and poems. A new anthem of defiance, while Traoré himself, standing on a balcony lit by torches, raised his hand and the crowd hushed as if the earth itself waited, his words carrying like lightning. They think weapons are power, but the true weapon is the spirit of a people who refuse chains. And the crowd erupted again, their roar shaking the night, while in a secret Mossad outpost, screens lit up with satellite feeds, agents murmuring, he is no longer one man, he is becoming a storm. And the chief only nodded grimly. Storms cannot be killed, only weathered, as planes roared over Gaza, rubble choking the air, mothers clutching children beneath collapsed walls, and across the seas protests swelled in European capitals, Berlin streets flooding with demonstrators carrying signs, not in our name, London bridges blocked by students, Paris aflame with marches, while in Africa drums beat across villages and cities alike, Elders nodding, youths chanting, leaders from Mali to Chad issuing cautious words. We will not stand idle. And in Moscow a smile curved across the foreign minister's lips. The empire fractures itself, while Beijing's representatives spoke softly but firmly. Every action breeds its opposite. The West's grip slips, and the Secretary General of the UN, weary-eyed, whispered to aides, "We are watching the birth of something dangerous, hope mixed with rage." And the camera of history zoomed in on two men locked in a battle of words and will. Netanyahu pacing like a caged beast, Traoré standing tall like an unbending tree. And somewhere between them the fate of nations trembled like a coin spun in the air, waiting to fall on one side or the other. In the dead of night, when the world seemed to hold its breath, Tel Aviv's skyline glowed like a blade unsheathed. Netanyahu stood by the window of his secure residence, his reflection fractured against the glass, his voice low, speaking not to his advisors but to himself. The world fears him because he dares to speak, but words are not iron. Words cannot pierce armor. Yet somewhere deep in his mind a shadow whispered, "But words can outlive empires," and he shoved the thought aside with a growl, calling his aides again. "Bring me options, airstrike, sabotage, propaganda." We silence him now. While across the Sahara Desert, under a sky dripping with stars, Traoré sat by a campfire with his closest comrades, the firelight flickering over his determined face, his tone both gentle and unyielding. "They believe I am one man, but I am the echo of millions, and echoes do not die. They multiply." His companions nodded, one soldier grinning fiercely. "Captain, they cannot bomb a heartbeat." Laughter rippled among them before fading back into silence, the distant sound of drums echoing from villages like a heartbeat of the continent itself. And far away in New York, inside the Security Council chamber, diplomats argued until veins bulged, an American voice snapping, "This rhetoric fuels instability," a Russian retort sharp as a knife. Instability for whom? For your allies or for the people you trample? China's delegate simply leaned forward, calm and deadly. "The world is not your chessboard anymore." And as the chamber boiled, outside on the streets protesters waved banners with Traoré's words. Their chants a river that drowned the noise of traffic. "If you start a war, we strike back," painted on walls, sung in rap lyrics, scrawled across university gates from Dakar to Detroit, and the digital battlefield flared. Hackers leaking documents, anonymous accounts spreading footage of bombings, counter-accounts smearing Traoré as a terrorist puppet. Yet the narrative refused to be contained. The more they tried to strangle it, the louder it screamed. And in Ouagadougou's presidential compound, Traoré watched silently as his advisors debated. One voice urging, "We must prepare militarily alliances." Weapons, another warning, "To match Israel's arsenal is impossible." Traoré lifted his hand, silencing them, his voice steady. "We do not fight on their field. We fight on ours, with unity, with conviction, with truth." And as he spoke, the camera of history seemed to zoom in on his face, sweat beading his brow, his eyes burning with something that was not mere ambition but conviction, carved from centuries of struggle, while Netanyahu, thousands of miles away, raged in his war room, slamming his palm against the map. Crush him before he becomes untouchable. But a general dared to whisper, "Sir, crushing him may only sanctify him." Netanyahu whirled, eyes red, "Then bury him so deep no one remembers his name." Yet even as he spoke, murals of Traoré's face bloomed across cities. Graffiti of his words sprouted overnight. Songs praising him spread through TikTok, through radios, through whispers in refugee camps. His image carried in protests from South America to Southeast Asia, and the momentum shifted like a tide too vast to dam. Intelligence reports stacking on Netanyahu's desk. Youth in North Africa rallying under his call. West African militaries murmuring alliance. European streets restless. And in Washington, analysts clutched their foreheads. We are watching the rise of a global icon outside our control. The Pentagon murmuring of contingency plans. Wall Street trembling at instability, and in Moscow laughter echoed in gilded halls. The empire chokes on its own leash, Beijing's leaders quietly strategized. We can use this storm. While in the heart of Gaza, a boy clutching a slingshot whispered to his brother. He speaks for us, and his brother whispered back. Then we are not alone. And in the shadows of Jerusalem, churches' priests prayed, Lord, protect the innocent, while mosques thundered with sermons of defiance. And in Tel Aviv, a mother whispered to her soldier son, "Do not become a pawn in their games." But still the tanks rolled. The jets roared and the night bled with fire. Yet through it all, through the roar of missiles and the clatter of arguments in marble halls, one line kept ricocheting across the world like an unstoppable bullet. Start a war, and we'll strike back. And even the most powerful men in the world found themselves haunted by it, muttering it under their breath, seeing it spray-painted on walls they passed, hearing it whispered by aides who tried not to be heard, until it was no longer just Traoré's voice but the voice of millions stitched together into a single unyielding roar. And history, merciless as ever, leaned forward to watch what would come next. As the days bled into nights and nights into days, the world spun on a wire of tension so tight it threatened to snap with the smallest spark. Netanyahu in his bunker rubbing his temples raw, whispers from his ministers swirling like vultures, some urging restraint, others baying for blood, while his own inner voice screamed, "Lose control and you lose everything." Yet he barked outward, "Prepare the strike packages. If they will not fear words, let them fear fire." But across the deserts of Africa, Traoré mounted a stage before a sea of humanity, torches blazing like constellations brought down to earth, his uniform plain, his tone sharp as thunder. "You think power is missiles and fleets, but true power is people unafraid to stand. And tonight I tell you, Africa stands." The crowd exploded, fists punching the sky, women weeping, children chanting, the roar reverberating across borders, and satellites above recorded the swelling of something larger than armies, something no nation could bomb away. And in Washington, generals leaned over maps, whispering, "If this storm unites Africa, the geopolitical order tilts beyond repair." The president pressing his lips tight. "So we walk a knife's edge," Berlin wavering, Paris torn, London confused, Moscow gleeful, Beijing calculating, while in Gaza rubble smoldered and prayers rose like smoke, mothers whispering Traoré's name as if it were both shield and sword. And in Israel the streets split, half chanting for victory, half chanting for peace, the prime minister's ears ringing with contradiction, his hands trembling as he clutched the phone demanding American reassurance, only to hear hesitation, calculation, fear of domestic backlash. And for the first time a sliver of doubt crept into his steel mask. What if this boy's words outlive my missiles? Yet he growled it away, barking orders. Escalate until he breaks. While in Ouagadougou, Traoré's advisors fretted over reports of cyber attacks, assassination attempts, pressure mounting, but he brushed it off with a weary smile. "If they strike at me, it proves they fear me, and if they fear me, it means we are winning." Then he leaned closer, whispering to his men, "But remember, our fight is not with one man, not even one nation. It is with centuries of chains." His voice a vow that rippled like a wave across the torches. While across the ocean, protests in New York clogged avenues. In Berlin, students chained themselves to arms factories. In London, bridges shook with chants, and the words, his words, blazed on banners, shirts, memes, an anthem of the dispossessed. Even as Netanyahu snarled into microphones, "He is a danger, a destabilizer, a false prophet," his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief, because the more he shouted, the more the world seemed to turn away. And in back rooms, his generals muttered, "We cannot kill an idea." But he silenced them with a glare sharp enough to slice steel. Ideas burn if their bearer is ash. And secret missions were drawn. Drones dispatched, shadows moving in Ouagadougou, yet somehow each strike failed, each plan foiled, as though history itself leaned its hand to shield the captain. And rumors spread like wildfire. He is untouchable, the legend growing larger than the man. His face painted on walls in Rio, his words quoted in songs in Cairo. His stance studied by students in Delhi, and in Moscow the foreign minister laughed openly. They built an idol in trying to break him, Beijing's envoy nodding softly. The harder they grip, the more slips away. And the UN chamber became theater, nations shouting, alliances cracking, and the Secretary General muttering to his aide, "This is no longer about Gaza. This is about a world deciding who it belongs to." While in Africa, caravans of villagers marched miles to hear Traoré speak, women laying flowers at his feet, youths lifting their fists and chanting, "If you start a war, we strike back," until the words became less warning and more prophecy, etched into the marrow of a generation. And as Netanyahu stared into the abyss of his own choices, shadows beneath his eyes, trembling hands gripping the edges of his desk, he whispered almost in disbelief, "How did one man from the Sahel bend the world to his voice? while Traoré, looking at the night sky, whispered back to the silence, "Because truth spoken without fear is stronger than all your armies." And the camera of history pulled wide, the earth itself seeming to tilt, waiting, trembling, as though the next heartbeat might decide whether it fell into fire or into freedom. As thunder rolled above Jerusalem and lightning cracked across the horizon like the anger of heaven itself, Netanyahu stood before his generals, his voice ragged, his tie loosened, his eyes two burning coals and a face carved by sleepless fury. They cheer him as if he is a savior, but saviors bleed like men, and tonight I swear we will end him. And orders were signed. Drones lifted, satellites shifted, assassins whispered into motion. Yet across the sea in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood among his soldiers in the dark, the air heavy with dust and tension, his voice carrying softly but cutting sharper than any blade. "Do not fear their machines, for machines cannot kill what lives in the soul." And his men raised their rifles not as weapons but as symbols, pounding their chests, chanting his words into the night. And far from both, in Berlin, the chancellor faced a parliament in uproar, right and left colliding in fiery words, one side crying betrayal of Israel, the other demanding moral courage, and outside in the streets tens of thousands carried candles chanting for peace. While in Washington, the president sat alone in the Oval Office, the phone silent, the weight of empire heavy on his chest, his whisper almost a prayer. "Perhaps the world no longer bends to us." While in Moscow, champagne glasses clinked. In Beijing, calculators clicked. And in Paris, smoke rose from protest fires that blurred the Eiffel Tower itself. The world spinning towards something raw and new. And in Gaza, a child barefoot among ruins scrawled Traoré's words in chalk on a wall, smiling faintly though the night shook with bombs. And in Tel Aviv, an Israeli mother knelt by her son's empty bed, tears wetting her hands, whispering, "This cannot be our destiny." While in the skies above, drones streaked toward Africa, their engines screaming. But on the ground the people gathered, thousands, tens of thousands, flooding the streets, torches blazing, drums pounding, their chant rising into the heavens, drowning the hum of engines. "If you start a war, we strike back." And the drones turned, sensors confused by the massive heat and sound, their signals jammed by unseen hands, crashing harmless into deserts, and the crowd roared louder, their voices carrying across continents, while Netanyahu watched the failure unfold, his chest heaving, rage twisting into despair. "Even the machines betray me," he muttered, slumping into his chair, shadows consuming him, and somewhere in the silence of that defeat he heard his own voice from decades ago, young and full of fire, promising Israel safety, glory, destiny, and he realized with a hollow chill that he had become a man chasing echoes of a past that no longer existed. While in Ouagadougou the night broke into dawn, the sun rising red and gold over a sea of chanting faces, Traoré stepping onto the balcony, sweat gleaming on his brow, his eyes burning with both triumph and burden, his voice hoarse but unbroken as he shouted above the roar, "This is not my victory. It is yours, the victory of every people who refuse chains." And the roar shook the earth, cameras capturing it, satellites beaming it, headlines exploding. The day Africa stood tall, and in universities across Europe, in barrios across South America, in slums across Asia, in villages across Africa, people whispered the same, "If you start a war, we strike back, not as threat but as creed," as prophecy. And Netanyahu, alone in his bunker, covered his face with his hands, the weight of isolation crushing him, the cheers of the world outside sounding like thunder he could not silence, and the scene cut like a blade between the two men, one rising like dawn, one sinking like dusk, while the narrator of history whispered to the audience unseen, "Empires fall not when armies collapse, but when their stories no longer command belief." And the camera panned across the globe, to protests, to prayers, to chants, to tears, to laughter, to fire, to hope, to fear, a planet trembling at the edge of transformation. And finally it zoomed in one last time on Traoré's face as he gazed at the horizon, eyes fierce, voice low but carrying to the ends of the earth, "We are awake now and we will never sleep again." And with those words the screen faded to black, leaving the world in stunned silence, the echo of his defiance still ringing like a drumbeat in the hearts of millions. A single line carved forever into history's stone, "Start a war and we'll strike back."